Well, welcome to the Montana State Capitol. My name is Deb Mitchell. I'm going to be your tour guide today. I work over across the street at the Motnana-Historical-Society, so we'd love to have you come visit us there. On our tour today, we're going to see two separate sides of the Montana State Capitol. We're going to see the part that was built in 1899 and the part that was built in 1902. We're standing in the rotunda right now. This rotunda means round room with a dome. And so what we see here is a very, very round area with niches in the corners. It rises 125 feet to the top. And the outside of the dome is all covered with copper. The copper that's on the top of the Capitol came from Butte, and Butte was actually in the running in, when Montana decided to be a state. We were a territory for 25 years. Governor Toole was the governor of the state at that time. And so Governor Toole asked the Pedretti brothers to come and decorate the Capitol. So what you're seeing in here, what you're going to see in here is a Greek neoclassical type design mixed with Western paintings. And you would never think those two things would go together, but they go together great. So looking at the rotunda, in the niches, we see the paintings. You see the green and white paintings with the lady's face. The style of this painting is called trompe-l'oeil, and that's French, and it means trick of the eye or to fool the eye. And what it does is it pulls that painting out and makes it look three-dimensional. So it looks like it's standing out at you as opposed to flat on the wall. You'll see a lot of that throughout the Capitol today. Originally, this is the painting that was on the Capitol when it was first made in 1899. They finished the Capitol in 1902, and what we're looking at is a reproduction of the original. In the 60s, the 60s was a interesting time. Let's call it an interesting time. A lot of things changed at that time. They wanted to update things. They wanted to tear down the old, put up new. So at that time, the whole Capitol was reinvented. And what they did was this whole area right here, they put faux paintings on the niches to make it look like a tile stacked up. And the floor that you see was just made into a terrazzo tile. The one really, really cool thing that they did was put the state seal in the middle of the rotunda here. And if anybody is still interested in that state seal, it's still there. It's just under the tile that's been put in to make it look like it did when it was first built. The only one thing that changed at that time was the blue tile that you see on the floor was actually glass tile. But because of seismic updating, which means updating for earthquakes, we had to put a solid tile on because there's steel beams running through here and running through a lot of the Capitol. In 1935, there was a very large earthquake, and a lot of Helena was damaged at that time. But the great thing about the Capitol was that on the 14 acres that it sits, it was flexible enough to accommodate the earthquake, and we only ended up with a few cracks in the marble wainscot that you see that goes halfway up. And Montana is an earthquake zone, so we have plenty of earthquakes here, but the last really big one was in 1935. The roundel paintings that you see here represent different cultures in Montana, and the one that we see over here is Chief Charlot. He was the chief of the Salish. The one here is Henry Edgar, who represents the miners in Montana. Mining was a very, very productive part of Montana. Over here we have Jim Bridger, representing the explorers coming through Montana. And the one behind me is just a Montana cowboy. Doesn't really represent anybody specific, but he's there to represent the cowboy culture in Montana. So we're very well represented by diverse cultures that are here in Montana. The columns that you see here are actually not weight-bearing columns, they're actually hollow. And they were made hollow to accommodate the electricity. Montana was the very first capital in the nation to be made with electricity and elevators and running water. So we were pretty much ahead of our time during that era. And Colorado decided to build their capital at the same time, but they opted to use gas lighting because they thought the electricity was going to be a fad. So they had to convert theirs to electricity eventually. But these columns are hollow to accommodate the electrical wiring that goes up through them. They're actually made out of plaster, and they're called scagliola. And it's a technique that is actually starting to come back a lot, but it's a series of plaster with chips of marble in it, and then put on layer by layer by layer. And if you touch them and feel them, they actually feel cold, just like marble feels, but you very, very seldom can tell the difference. The only two weight-bearing ones we have are up here in the large window on the second floor. The Pedrettis were interior designers. They were here to decorate the Capitol. They were not historical reproducers, or they weren't historical painters. Their goal was to decorate the Capitol, and they did a fantastic job. Like I said, what you see here is similar to what they were known for decorating and known for designing, which was a lot of churches, synagogues, cathedrals, things like that. So it was comparable to a lot of that. You see opera houses. I see a lot of opera house here, just because of the balconies that you see that jet out and the stairways and things like that. It just reminds me of, there's some characteristics of an opera house, which is what the Pedrettis were famous for designing. Now the lights that you see in the arches up here, those were reproduced in the 60s. They took those completely out. But we put those back in 2000. The renovation was done in 2000. And we put those back in, and the scrolls that you see behind the lights are some more of that trompe l'oeil, and they look like they're standing out. It looks like a medallion that's standing out, but actually they're flat on the walls. And they're absolutely gorgeous. Those really, really look like they're a three-dimensional item. The barrel vault that you see above the staircase has an interesting story that goes with it. It's rounded, and the glass that you see there, there's probably 5% of that glass that's the original glass. In the 60s, they took that completely out and put a flat ceiling in there with a room up above. And then during the renovation, we took that out, and we found the glass that you see there was stored in Virginia City. Charlie Bovey was an avid collector, and he stored it there, but it wasn't stored correctly. So a lot of it was broken, a lot of it was cracked, and we weren't able to use all of it. We were able to use about 5% of it. The rest is redone by Evergreen Studios in New York, and they did an amazing job. At the end of the barrel vault, there's a beautiful painting called Driving the Golden Spike, and it used to be in this area right here. Before, when they took this out, when they took the barrel vault out, they moved that to this area. So then in 2000, we had to remove it from there and put it back into the barrel vault. And the stained glass that you see at the top of the stairs is all original. Yeah, it was not damaged in the 1935 earthquake, so it's all original. All across Montana, people are coming back to preservation and wanting to preserve the past. And the best way to do that is with buildings. Buildings within your community, buildings within your area. If you can preserve those buildings and reuse them and tell the stories about them, that's phenomenal. And Montana is very, very big on providing those stories. Anywhere you go in Montana, you'll find some building, some area that's been preserved and are able to go through and hear the story about it. Here we are on the second floor. One of my favorite areas on the second floor is the statue of Mike Mansfield and his wife Maureen. And this statue was dedicated in the year 2001. The artist is Gareth Curtis, and he did an amazing job catching the essence of Mike Mansfield and his wife. Mike was from Butte. He was a blue-collar worker. He worked in the mines. His wife Maureen was behind him on 100%, and she was a teacher. She sold her life insurance policy to get the money to put him through school. And he did go to school here in Montana. He's an amazing person. He was the longest running congressman in the US Senate. And he was admired by many. He was for the people, and he was the Japanese ambassador. And his wife Maureen was an amazing woman. She was the woman behind him, and she was always dressed in Chanel, and that's what he's got her dressed in right here. And you can see her looking up at him adoringly. And Mike just absolutely thought the world of her. In fact, he didn't mind having this statue here. He was ecstatic to be able to have this statue here. However, when you read the title of it, it's titled Maureen and Mike Mansfield. He wanted to make sure that her name was first. The painting that I talked about on the first floor, the Driving the Golden Spike, you can see here. And it's a great, great painting, and it's called Driving the Golden Spike, which is amazing because they didn't drive a golden spike. What they did is they took the first spike in the railroad when it was started in Minnesota, brought it over, put it in so it could be the first and the last spike driven into the railroad. There was no golden spike. It's just a matter of drama and making it more dramatic than it really was. The person with the hammer is a past president at that time, Ulysses S. Grant. And the Native Americans that you see there, the Indians that you see there, are the Crow Indians, and they were invited to come to the ceremony because a large portion of the railroad did run through their territory. The scene of this painting, where this was at, is in an area between Helena and Missoula called Gold Creek, Montana. And if you look there, you can find a marker that talks about the Golden Spike. There were thousands of people there at that time. The women's murals that you see here are one of the newer additions to the Capitol. We had a lot of women in the legislature who said, where are the women represented here? We have men, obviously, and we have the Native Americans, but women were an important part of the building of Montana. This was put in 2014, which was the anniversary of the Vote for Women, the 100-year anniversary. And the artist is Hadley Ferguson. She did an amazing job representing the women in Montana. You see all types of women. And if it wasn't for the women, we wouldn't have libraries. We wouldn't have opera houses, we wouldn't have theaters, we wouldn't have any type of entertainment like that, because it's the women that made those in the communities. My mom always told me, if it wasn't for women, we wouldn't have celebrations like Christmas and birthdays and things like that, because the women are the ones that take care of that. If it was all men, none of those things would be happening. But the mural is on both sides here, and the Native American women are represented in there, highly represented, and the pioneer women, the more modern women of today. So it very well tells the story of women in Montana and how important they were. This is the centennial bell. This is the bell that rang in the statehood of Montana when we became a state in 1889. And then it was rang again in 1989. And I'm assuming that it's going to be rang again in 2089. I won't be around for that, but some of you might. This room is what we call the old Supreme Court chambers. And initially, when the Capitol was first built, this is where the Senate met. And the House of Representatives was across the rotunda on the other side. And which is pretty much the norm for every state capitol. You have the Senate on one side, you have the House on the other. But when the new part was built in 1912, the House wanted to move into the new part. And so the Senate moved out of this room into the old House of Representatives, and this became the old Supreme Court. Now our courtroom is about 2 blocks east of us, and all court is held there. This room is used for meetings, events, hearings during the legislative session. That's why you see the rostrum up here with the microphones. And during hearings, people can come in and talk about the pros, the cons of any bill that's going through the process of becoming a law. And that process is long and harboring, but it's necessary. Every state capitol goes through this. This room, the 60s didn't get a hold of this room. What you see here is pretty much the way it looked when it was first built. The chandelier that you see here is a reproduction chandelier. In the 60s, the chandeliers in both the House and the Senate were taken out, and they put in fluorescent lighting. They were big on fluorescent lighting in the 60s. So they took these absolutely gorgeous chandeliers out and put in flat fluorescent lighting underneath the stained glass you see up here and around it. And they sold the chandeliers at auction. Well, Charles Bovee, the same gentleman who owned Virginia City, bought one of the chandeliers, and he hung it in Virginia City in a dance hall for many, many years. And once we found it, we purchased it back and brought it back here. The other one, we don't know where it went to. Probably was used for scrap metal. So the one that you see here in the old Supreme Court is the reproduction. The one that we'll get to see in the Senate chambers is the original one. So thank goodness we have those people that like to collect things and big things. The paintings in here are the original paintings from the Pedrettis. And like I said, the Pedrettis were hired to decorate. They were not historical artists. So if a historical artist came and looked at these paintings, they could totally pick them apart because they're not historically correct. They're here to decorate the Capitol, not be examined as historical. And they do an amazing job at that. So we'll start over here. This is Gates of the Mountains, which is north of us. This is where, on the Missouri River, this is where Lewis and Clark came through. The next one you see is Indian attack on a wagon train. And that is something that was brought forward much more in movies, John Wayne movies, Clint Eastwood movies. You see a lot of attacks on wagon trains. In Montana, there are actually only 2 recorded attacks on wagon trains. The one in the front on the left-hand side is the signing of the Enabling Act. The one in the middle is Lewis and Clark spotting the Rocky Mountains for the first time. And I can just imagine what he's saying. Oh my God, we got to go over those. The one on the right side is the signing of the statehood of Montana. It's actually the statehood of Montana, Washington, and Oregon. Idaho didn't become a state till later. Then we have the Indians on a buffalo hunt. This is one that could, a historical artist could really pick apart, but it does tell the story, and it's Indians chasing the buffalo. The buffalo are quite small in this painting. They're actually larger than that. They would never be hunting buffalo with a full headdress like that, but it does tell the story and provide the essence of the Native Americans here in Montana, which was very, very important at that time and at this time to have that inclusion. The last one that you see here is saying farewell to the buffalo. And this is the Native Americans saying thank you to the buffalo for giving his life so that they could sustain theirs. And it's also a transition type painting because you can see the train in the background coming in, the invasion of the Euro-Americans coming in and taking over the Native American land. And that's what I see. That's the beauty of painting. It's all subjective. And somebody else can look at this painting and see something completely different. And it's amazing to get to talk about art because you learn so much from what somebody else says. Up above us here is the gallery. And anytime anybody wants to come and watch any of the proceedings during the state legislature, they can come and sit in the gallery. The chairs that are there are the original chairs. And when you do come and are able to watch what's going on, look under one of the chairs up there because every chair has a cowboy hat rack. And I gave a tour to a gentleman from Texas, and he says Texas doesn't even have that. Back when the Capitol was first built, hats were a very important part of men's attire, and they rarely went out without their hat on. More of the scagliola columns that you see in here. The light fixtures are the original light fixtures. The globes that you see over it obviously are not our reproductions, but the light fixtures are. That's exactly what it looked like when it was first built in 1902. And you can also in the corners see the cornucopias, and those are trompe-l'oeils. Okay, we're standing in front of the building on the 3rd floor. This window that you see here looks out into the Prickly Pear Valley. Prickly pear is a cactus, and it's called that for a reason because the Prickly Pear Valley was full of cactus when Lewis and Clark came through. It's a beautiful, beautiful view that you can see here, and you can also see the sleeping giant. I don't know if anybody has ever seen the sleeping giant before, but he's in the mountains. He's kind of a silhouette between the sky, and he's one of the mountains. You can see his bulbous nose and his chest kind of sticking up, but he is Helena's sleeping giant. The flags that you see out here are all new, and we're very proud to have them here. They represent all the tribes in Montana. Every tribe has their own tribal flag. The statue that you see out front is Thomas Francis Meagher, who was an Irish patriot, and Both Helena and Butte are very Irish-oriented communities. And to the Irish, Thomas Francis Meagher was a hero. Came out to Montana and was the interim governor of Montana just before they voted Sidney Edgerton into being the governor of Montana. And he's kind of a controversial person, but to represent the Irish community, this was a gift from the Irish community to the state of Montana, representing their culture here in Montana. And like I said, the Irish were very prominent in Helena and Butte, and that was because of the mines. They came over to work in the mines. This room is the Senate chambers. As I said before, the Senate chambers used to be the House of Representatives, and then in 1912, when the House moved to the newer section, the Senate moved in here. So they've been in here since 1912. This room changed a lot during the 60s. The desks that you see here are reproduction desks. There's 6 original desks here, and they're the ones that have the gold plaque on them. You can see the gold plaque. It tells you who was seated in that chair during some of the session years. The chairs are obviously reproduction. There used to be just straight wooden chairs in here, not very comfortable. These are quite comfortable. The buttons that you see on the desk are the voting buttons. Green is yay, red is nay, and all of that shows up on the screen that you see above the bas-relief here. All of that shows up on there, how the senators and how they voted, because that's a matter of public record. And again, we have the gallery up above that anybody can come and watch any of the proceedings. And you can see how everybody has voted. The rostrum that you see up in the front is the original rostrum. And the chairs that you see in the front around the rostrum are for the pages. And that's something that I think every kid, especially if you're interested in political science, should come and experience, because you can apply when you're a junior or senior in high school to become a page for a week. And you come and you get paid for that week, not a lot, but you get paid, and you run errands for the people in this room. And you get coffee for them, you get copies of bills, you do whatever is asked of you to do. You set up the room previously. It's a great experience to be able to provide, and it's a great experience for you to be able to do, because it's a learning opportunity of how the state legislature works. And it's an opportunity for you to see if this is a direction that you would like to go when you get out of school. Now, there's 50 senators in the state of Montana. The Senate serves a 4-year term, and they can only serve 2 terms within 16 years. And when we get to the House, we'll talk about them a little bit more. But there, like I said, there's only 50 senators in here, 1 from each district. Some of them represent 2 districts. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of banter back and forth that goes on in this room during the session. The paintings that you see in here, again, were done by the Pedrettis. The one in the front is the Louisiana Purchase, and which is, a lot of people don't realize, is a big part of Montana history. The Louisiana Purchase was between Thomas Jefferson and Napoleon Bonaparte, and We purchased this whole area of Montana and the northern plains and the southern plains from France. And who knows, if he wouldn't have done that, we may all be speaking French right now. But in this painting, it's not actually how it happened, because Thomas Jefferson and Napoleon Bonaparte never even met each other, let alone sit across from a table and discuss all this. It was all done by correspondence. But this is what you call artistic license, where the artist can represent it in a different way. And this is how they wanted to have it represented at that time. And the painting that you see in the back of this tells us that this was probably all done in France. The gentlemen you see here are Montana miners. They're doing what's called placer mining. The next one is Fathers Ravalli and De Smet. The one on the back wall here is the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And this is quite interesting because it doesn't really portray the battle as it really was. It portrays Custer as being a hero at that time. Custer was a man who looked after himself most of the time. The one thing that I find amazing about this picture or painting is the Indian that you see there. His name is Rain in the Face, and he's one that claims to have killed Custer that day. We actually don't know who killed Custer. I think there were many that claimed to have killed Custer that day. But he claimed to have killed Custer that day, and I just think his name is very, very cool, Rain in the Face. And when you go to the battlefield, there is the Native American memorial there, and you'll find his name on there. And then you'll also find the American soldier memorial there. The next one you see is Lewis and Clark at Three Forks, and it's a very, very stereotypical type painting. You see Lewis and Clark, you see Sacagawea inside the teepee, but she's dressed more like a Navajo Indian. At that time, Indians were Indians. They didn't distinguish between tribes, but she looks more like a Navajo. And then York, who's in the background, is portrayed very stereotypical of a black person at that time. And the last one we see is Andrew Dawson and Pierre Choteau at Fort Benton. And that's Fort Benton that you can see in the background in the Missouri River. The original chandelier here. Underneath the screen up here is a bas relief. This was done, put in 2005. It was done by a gentleman from California. Bas relief means raised, a raised painting. So it looks like it's carved. It's very, very, very heavy. The name of this is called We Proceeded On, and it's of Lewis and Clark. You see Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea and the troops pushing out the canoes. You see the dog seamen. Eugene Daub is the artist. Okay, the part that I'm in right now is the part that was built in 1902. And stepping over this is the part that was built in 1912. By 1912, they thought that they'd outgrown the Capitol and they needed more room. So that's when this part was built. And you can really tell the difference outside with the stone, because the stone on both the East and West editions are a lot lighter than what you see on the original. This is the House lobby. This is an amazing part of the Capitol. It's very, very beautiful. The paintings that you see in here were done in 1912, and at that time they asked Montana artists to do the paintings for us. And these were done by Edgar Paxson. And so he was actually from New York. And you can kind of tell from the paintings that he did a lot of backdrop paintings for plays and things like that. And they asked him to do these paintings that you see in here. He was a much more historical artist. So these are, historically, these are more correct than the ones we saw in the House and, or, I'm sorry, in the Senate and in the old Supreme Court. The ones in here, this is called After the White Man's Book. This shows the Salish Indians marching, not marching, but heading to the white man territory to collect the white man's book, which means the Bible, because they thought if they had the white man's medicine mixed with their medicine, they would be invincible. They did not realize that the white man was not going to let them keep their medicine and keep their culture. It had to be taken away, all or nothing, basically. The one you see here is the Indians meeting the Euro-Americans, and kind of that moment in time when this whole transition period took place. You can kind of see the skeptical looks on the Native Americans' faces, and the looks of not sure what's going to happen on the Euro-Americans' faces. The one in that corner is of Chief Joseph, who was actually the spiritual leader of the Nez Perce Indians. And this is him giving his famous speech, "I will fight no more forever," in the Bear Paw Mountains, where he was captured. And here we have Pierre de la Vendre, who was one of the first explorers to ever see Montana. And here we have Lewis and Jim Bridger. And this is one of the more well-known ones. This is Lewis and Clark at Three Forks. This is the one that's on the cover of Undaunted Courage. So a lot of people recognize this. You see Clark, then Lewis, then Sacagawea, her husband Pierre Choteau, and then York and Jim Bridger on the other side. This is where Sacagawea started recognizing the area from which she came from. She was Shoshone, who was captured by the Mandan and taken to the Mandan village. That was a very common practice at that time, is capturing and using other people from other tribes as slaves. So she was raised in the Mandan village, but she started recognizing a lot of this area down by the Beaver Head that was her native homeland. We're standing to the entrance of the House of Representatives. This is the largest room in the Capitol. Straight on the back wall, you can see the painting by Charles M. Russell. This was one of his masterpiece paintings. He painted this in Great Falls in a little log studio. And he had to raise the studio by 3 logs in order to get this painting in there. And he painted it in 3 months, which is totally amazing. And this is called the Salish, Lewis and Clark meeting the Salish Indians at Ross's Hole. And the Salish Indians are part of, are also known as the Flathead Indians, but there's no tribe of Indians called the Flatheads. It's a misnomer, and it came about. There's a lot of different speculations as to how the name came about. I had one Salish lady tell me it was because of the way the Salish men combed their hair. They would comb it straight up and then flat on top. They'd put bear grease on it and comb it straight up and flat on top. Could be, you know, from that. There is also a tribe of Indians that are from the West Coast, because the Salish are one of the few Indians that journeyed from the West Coast toward the east, as opposed of being pushed from the east to the west. So they came from the western coast. So there's some coastal Indians there that are Salish. And they were the ones that put the board on the front and back of the baby's head and actually flattened the head because they thought that was very desirable. They don't do that anymore, obviously, but that's another speculation as to how they got the name. But just so you know, there's no tribe of Indians called the Flathead Indians. There's the Pend Oreille, the Salish, and the Kootenai, and they make up the Flathead Confederation. So that's what you see here is the Flathead Indians and meeting Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark are over on the right side of the picture, standing behind Toby. Toby was their guide. And they were standing behind him, and Sacagawea is standing behind the Lewis and Clark. And the Salish Indians are in the foreground, and they are the main focus of the painting. And that's what Charlie Russell wanted. He wanted them to be the main focus of the painting because they were the first Americans here. And he always felt like the Indians were getting, the Montana Indians were getting a raw deal and getting moved off their land and being displaced and having nowhere to go. And so he wanted them to be the focus of the painting. So that's why you see it like this. The pillars that you see in this room are solid marble, and they came from Vermont. At that time, we had a little bit more money to spend. And then there's also the gallery upstairs that you can, with the original seats, that you can come and watch any of the proceedings. Now, there's 100 members in the House of Representatives. They serve a 2-year term. And a lot of times they can serve for 2 years. And usually 2 years is 1 term for us because we're biannual. So a lot of times there are new ones coming in and a few of the seasoned ones staying, and so it's always new faces, new voices coming into this area. The desks and the chairs that you see in here are the original ones. They saw what happened to the Senate in the 60s, so they mandated that this room could not change historically, and so that's why you see the original chairs and the original desks in this room. If you were to be able to go in and open one of the desk drawers, you would see names scratched in there from hundreds of years ago of people who sat in that particular desk, and it's, you know, that in itself tells a lot of history.